Welcome to the Someone Gets Me podcast, where you'll hear stories of inspiration and hope realized. Hosted by Dianne Allen, intuitive empowerment mentor who specializes in working with people who want to be freed from being stuck in life. You will hear personal stories and professional insights, along with tips on how to conquer overthinking, procrastination, and more. Here's Dianne.
Hi, everybody. It's Dianne. It's Someone Gets Me again. And I have an amazing interview for you today. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to fit how amazing this gentleman is in this podcast, but we're going to give it our best. I have with me a guest. His name is Marc Smolowitz, and he is from San Francisco. He is an amazing award-winning director of great documentary films that really help us see what needs to happen in our social environment. He's a real forerunner, one of those trailblazing type people that steps out into parts of our thinking and our way of believing that challenge us to do better and be better at every turn. So he's got a lot of guts and a lot of courage and a lot of creativity. He knows one of our previous guests, Julie Skolnick, who was an episode, I think back in October. You will love her interview too. And so he has around him great people, and he is a great person. He's working on a film right now called The G Word, which is about giftedness and intelligence and neurodiversity. And I'm going to ask him lots of questions about that because that's my interest. And he also has other films. There's tons of them. So I'm going to put all of the references for you in the show notes because there is more. If I read it all, we would not get to the interview. And I really want you to hear from this amazing man who is really doing great things for our culture, our society, and the world at large. So Marc, welcome to the show.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Dianne. That was such a kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to you today. So right on. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So what I'd like to start with a little bit is, who is Marc? Like, how did you get to this amazing place of being so creative and imaginative, but using it toward the betterment of our society and culture? There has to be something that kind of got that spark going. And I think we would love to hear about how you got where you are.
Well, that's a great question. You're right. I didn't just sort of pop up, and become this, right? There's a journey that has unfolded over many, many years. I actually just turned 50 back in November of 2018. So that was a important, milestone. I think anytime a person turns 50, it really, affords you a chance to kind of touch back with your own journey and sort of where have you been? Where are you now? Where are you going? I grew up in a family where, my parents were liberal Jewish Democrats. I was born in New York. We moved to New Jersey, and eventually it was my mother's career that took us to Los Angeles. So my mother was a working mom who was on a trajectory of career success in the 70s and 80s that was pretty uncommon, for someone, like herself. She had been an immigrant. She was a Holocaust survivor from Poland and came to the U.S. by way of Israel in 1956. My grandparents, who I call Debbie and Zadie, were also Holocaust survivors. And so, the three of them were, a huge influence in my life, as you can imagine. And so, I sort of phrase it like this, in Poland, before the Holocaust, there were 3 million Jews, okay? After the Holocaust, there were 30,000 Jews. 3 of those 30,000 Jews were my mother, my grandmother, and my grandfather. So if that kind of odds doesn't give a young Jewish kid a sense of purpose, I don't know what does. So I always had a fire in my belly around, just life in general. We talked very openly about what happened in the Holocaust. It was not something to be afraid of. It was something to look at and to understand. And so that narrative, which, comes out of being targeted, being disenfranchised, and being oppressed, and, for broader context, my buddy and Zadie, they had 18 brothers and sisters. All of their husbands and wives and all of their children perished in concentration camps. So that's pretty stark stuff for a kid to be growing up with, right, in his family, And it was unique because I was growing up in the 70s, and most of the other kids around me, were not children of recent immigrants. I grew up with Yiddish and Polish and Hebrew in my house. And that sense of being a part of something bigger than my own story was always at play in my childhood. And I took those, that sense of ancestral history into my early adulthood for sure. I went to college and became immediately interested in social justice and activism in the 80s. And this was a time when, becoming openly gay was quite challenging because of the AIDS crisis. And so I was that generation of young gay kids who came right after the advent of AIDS. And so imagine how challenging that was to define your gay identity in the 80s in response to this horribly scary disease that was, taking down the entire gay community in major cities. I was in Los Angeles. So high school was strange. High school was tough. From that perspective, as open as some aspects of the 80s really were, for sure, and certainly in LA for sure, it really was a very, very strange decade. There was a lot going on that was pushing us, out into the mainstream, but also a lot that was holding us back. And I remember it very, very well. I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a sophomore in high school, and I was at, a top public high school in Los Angeles, North Hollywood High School. And I was in student government. It was a second period every day. So it was your homeroom period. It was the longer class. So as someone who was in student government, I was able to, I was one of the 10th grade representatives, and I was one of two. And we were having a planning meeting because we were going to have a talent show, a school-wide talent show. It was Los Angeles, so there were lots of talented kids in my high school. I went to school with Cuba Gooding. I went to school with Molly Ringwald. I mean, these were, we had some pretty talented kids in our school. And there was immediately a groundswell of enthusiasm for me being the MC of this talent show. I always had very strong public speaking skills. I was a very strong leader from a very, very early age. I just reeked of confidence and the gift of the gab, which I'm sure you're sensing in this conversation. And I cherished that ability. It was really a huge piece of my identity. And I think if anything, it was the thing that empowered me to take on homophobia and take on things that might be coming at me as a child or a teenager, and feel a sense of empowerment in spite of those things. All of a sudden, my teacher, she kind of squashes the idea, like really dramatically, like in a way that was disturbing to all of us, and I kind of I remember this so well. I rationalized it in my mind that I was not an upperclassman, that it was supposed to be someone who was a senior, or there needed to be some sort of democratic process for how this MC was chosen, or, that she had some, basis for, sort of squashing the idea that Marc shouldn't do this. A few minutes later, we're kind of all working in our special project groups or our committees, and she pulls me outside to talk to me. And I was immediately just trembling, like, what is this? And, this is what she said to me in 1983. She said to me, Marc, I want you to understand why I couldn't let you be the MC of our school-wide talent show. And I said, oh, I understand. It's okay. I really didn't want her to say anything. I was like, really trying to steer her away from her sick need to say something, because I knew what she was going to say was not going to be good. And she said to me, Dianne, I couldn't let you be the MC of our talent show because I wanted to protect you. And I said, protect you? Protect me? And she said, and I'm not paraphrasing, she said, well, Marc, I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but you're such a big faggot. And I was stunned. I started screaming in the hallway. All the kids, from student government run out to kind of see what's going on. And I went off on her. I mean, I was not having it. I was not having her homophobia. And this teacher, she did not know, she had not been trained, like, how to deal with, like, a strong gay kid who actually, like, will stand up to her and her homophobia. And it was startling. Short version of that story is, we're at the guidance counselor's office. She doesn't know how to deal with me either. my wonderfully supportive parents and sister try to get involved, and, they're still in their own stage of figuring out who I am and how to support that journey, right? But for the record, they did great. But guess what? This kid who was gifted and who had tons of leadership potential, I had to exit student council and spend my sophomore year, second grade, in study hall because this woman could not wrap her mind around what to do with me. And it was a hugely defining moment around who I am and how my identity plays out in society and what I'm going to be up against. And I was not having it. I was ready to fight. And I was proud of myself. My parents, my sister were proud of me. I did not take it lying down. And even though the outcome was me like having to leave the group, she heard me, and the guidance counselor heard me. So why am I telling you all this? These early defining experiences around understanding oppression and being targeted for identity have played into my commitments as a storyteller, throughout the rest of my career. So when you look at my portfolio of films, you see not just stuff about LGBT, but stuff about, people and characters and communities that are traditionally what we see as being at the margins of our society. But my film work and my company puts those stories at the center where they rightly belong. And that's a huge part of how I roll and how I make films, and also how I move through the world. With that, I'll say, I was early on an AIDS activist. I came into my identity as a young adult at the height of the AIDS crisis. So I was early on politicized around that and became very active in that world. And that was tremendously empowering training for everything that I would become in my later career. Because when you're an activist, when you're someone who's working boots on the ground to try and make a difference and do social change, those are all the skills that go into producing movies. They are so related. They're, like managing logistics, managing schedules, managing people, managing resources, making sure that the press are engaged, making sure that all these things that go into social movements, like go into making art, go into producing events, go into producing, stuff that gets people excited and gets them charged up to be a part of culture. So hopefully that was a good way to get to know me a little bit. But, for whatever reason, I was blessed to not be traumatized by all the things I'm describing to you so much that in spite of those traumatic things, I persevered, and I found a sense of the four selves that I really highlight in this movie even, which is self-worth, self-esteem, self-agency, and self-efficacy. And I think the whole self is engaged in all four when we really know ourselves.
So, yes, that I love your story, and I see so many levels of it. And it's the resiliency of your grandmother and your parents obviously was taught to you behaviorally and otherwise for your own level of resiliency. So when you're up against things that other people might see as an insurmountable odds or some other kind of thing where they would maybe either be traumatized by it or confused, not know what to do with it, or those kinds of things, your upbringing and the education and the fact that your family didn't hold the secrets and owned and honored the journey of the people, whatever that journey is, the pretty stuff, the not so pretty stuff, the everything stuff, right? Like life is messy. And because your own family raised you without such a sense of denial and, covering it up and sugarcoating like a lot of people do, and overprotect you, so that then when you're faced with things as a teenager in what should be a progressive high school with a bunch of still ignorance, because ignorance is everywhere, you were able to stand in your authority and not be traumatized. And then, so I kind of see the rest of your career as like an ongoing movement of what was started when your family made it over here safely and had you. Then it started probably before you were born, just the way that goes. And so you are living out the purpose by stepping into who you're meant to be and not hiding and not pretending like it doesn't exist. So I think that's a fabulous story. And it's for me, a really good reminder for all of us, to let ourselves be resilient, and it's okay to be the torchbearer and do what's right and stand up for what's right for humanity.
Yeah, I think that, ultimately for me, I mean, when you talk about what's right for humanity, I think most of us can kind of agree on what that looks like. I think some of the, at least whole cloth, the sort of particulars or the details of how that plays out in different communities or in different families or in different schools or, in different geographies is obviously going to be what it's going to be, right? And sometimes we have to agree to disagree on what that looks like, as people. But ultimately, I think the idea of what it means to be human in the 21st century and who do we value, in the 21st century is a major theme in my life and in my work. I will say that, being an artist is, in my view, not something that I chose. It kind of chose me. Mm-hmm. I had no choice in the matter. I really had to live a creative life. I was wildly creative from a very, very early age. So creativity and leadership were my two tropes from a very, very early age. And an ability to read and write that was, kind of, astounding at a very early age. A comfort with language, with words, a love of spending time with adults who, I found kids interesting, but I found adults like infinitely interesting, and older adults. Like I have a memory of my dad had a heart attack when I was 9. Which was super scary, but another thing that was hugely traumatic, potentially hugely traumatic, but we dealt with it in a very real way in our family. And he was out of work for about 6 or more months at home, recovering from his heart attack. And during that period, he started, exercising and walking around the neighborhood, and he became best friends with a man in his 80s. I'll never forget. His name was Lou. And I just loved Lou. I loved talking to Lou. I loved coming home from school and Dad and Lou were there and I would hang out with them. And, I was 9, or 10 at that point. And, just this real sense of like admiration and respect for elders and their experience. And I loved hearing stories from Lou of, what life was like when he was a kid and what he was, his whole journey was just, really, really special. And, just worshipped my grandparents, of course. They were such, just the fact that, that we had them, was a miracle, but the fact that, they lived really to relatively old age was wonderful. But, on this idea of like not choosing the arts, but the arts chose me, I really believe that. I think, when you try to steer people away from a creative life into something more conventional or traditional, it's always going to backfire. We always go, but creative people always go back to being creative. We always go back to where we feel most, in our own skin. And that's how we persevere. That's how we find resilience, right? Because that's where we find a sense of place.
And I work a lot with creative people, and when you try to corral them, they get creative in how to not be corralled. So it doesn't really matter, in the end.
Yeah. The other thing about making art that I will share is that you cannot expect to do art, whether it's films or theater or writing or visual art or dance or whatever your work is about. You cannot do it so other people will like you. That's the big joke here. Okay, so much of how stuff gets promoted is about good press and good marketing and sort of focusing on success. But that's not why we do it. We don't do it so we'll be liked. Really good art challenges people, in every way. And inevitably, if you're not doing work where 2 out of 10 people don't like it, you're probably not doing very good work. I always joke that like 8 out of 10 people get what I'm doing, and the other 2, I can't worry about them, because if I worry about them, it'll make it difficult, to over focus on, their, needing to be liked, respected, or recognized by those people. Hopefully the work is so good that it brings those people along, right? And kind of keeps them in the conversation, keeps them in the room. That's a phrase I use a lot in my work, is keeping people in the room. Like, I want more people in the room than less. So if my work is so didactic or so ideological or so heavy-handed that people go, that's not for me, that's not me, then I don't think I'm really doing my job. And, my job, I feel as a filmmaker is really about communicating ideas to large numbers of people, right? I mean, if some films make sense in front of smaller audiences, maybe at museums, maybe at cinematheques, but most of what I work on mostly is big ideas that are trying to be communicated to large numbers of people on a national or global stage. And so you can't, if I sat around worrying about what everybody thought, that would be paralyzing, right? So rather, I take criticism into my soul and I work with it. And especially if it's meaningful critique, like that is something very early on that I learned to be really sit with and to hear it. I love feedback. I welcome it.
So let me ask a couple questions here.
Sure.
One is, what do you, Marc, like to do for fun and like stress reduction and to keep the balance in your life? Because what you're doing is so intense and passionate and wonderful, probably doesn't even feel like work because you're just in it and it's wonderful. And a lot of times, we can all just kind of go on that run, and we need to have something that gives us a divergent or a break or whatever. So what do you like to do for fun?
Well, fun is a part of my experience. I'm all about community, right? So, I'm an extremely extroverted person. I love the external world. So anything that gets me out in my city, experiencing life with others, whether it's my husband or our friends or, the community at large, that gets me charged. So, going out to films, going out to theater, going out to see art is never, stressful for me. In fact, it's important because as a culture producer, as someone who makes art, I need to be viewing art for two reasons. One, to stay engaged with like what's going on and what's hot, what are people doing, what's interesting right now. And I always want to try to lean into that and maybe even be ahead of that curve a little bit. But then also because I think that it's important to show up for other artists, right? And to kind of be their audience as well. I have an incredibly robust network of friends locally, nationally, globally, who are making great art in all kinds of media. And I get off on supporting them and showing up to, be there and be their audience. That said, I like to disconnect. I love exercise. I love the outdoors. I do power walks. Like people talk a lot about meditation and mindfulness and, sort of that as a tool to kind of, wrap yourself around with self-care. And I totally get that. I have struggled a bit with meditation as a sort of like ongoing practice in my life. It's really hard for me to slow down my mind. And I know that I benefit from it. So when I'm actually able to kind of slow down my mind is when I'm out doing my power walks. So my power walks are really a thing. I do them, almost daily. When I'm doing well, I'm doing them almost daily. And it's a great thing to do in San Francisco because you know what? It's like built-in cardio. We live in a city of hills. And so you don't have to go to the gym to, really get your heart pumping. And so the benefits of exercise and stress reduction are huge. And I've seen that in my life. And you know what, Dianne, when I don't do it, I'm more stressed out. Like it's just a given,
Right. In Florida, we have to get on treadmills and put it on incline to get the hills. You get the natural beauty of the hills and the landscape, But, it's like I work with a lot of 2E people, a lot of twice exceptional people. It's what I do, right? And we talk about meditation a lot because I have a meditation podcast as well, and I teach meditation and mindfulness. But one of the things that I've learned in my own life and the life of the people I work with, which are mostly musicians and athletes and creative people, is that we do our best meditation when we're moving. And so moving meditations, mine is swimming a lot. Yours is power walking, and I have several people that do it when they're running or doing some physical activity that can have a rhythm of mind, body, and soul, has the same kind of meditative benefit as somebody who can sit and do mindfulness, because the gifted brain has multiple channels going on, and asking a gifted person to not think is kind of funny. So we have to find a way to kind of get part of the brain going in one direction while the body and everybody else can do the other. So I'm really glad you brought that up about the power walking and that you use that as a meditation, because that I teach that all the time, because a lot of people who have fast moving brains, and it's a genius, and our genius, and I have a couple of savant clients, they're like, well, I can't sit. I said, well, I don't expect you to sit. There's other ways to get that brain harmony and the benefit. and the payoff or the stress reduction without creating more stress with yourself, trying to figure out how to do something that's not natural to your brain. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's wonderful. Now I have a question that I really been want to ask you, and I don't want to run out of time before I get to ask you this, because I think it's an important topic that you're addressing in the G Word film. That's about giftedness and intelligence and neurodiversity, because a lot of people, I've heard somebody the other day say, well, gifted, that's a word that doesn't mean anything. It's only for kids. Well, that's not true. And all of these other things, we could go on for days about all the things people say that aren't true. And I would like you to speak briefly, because I have another question right behind it, about neurodiversity and what it is for the person who's listening who probably has neurodiversity but doesn't have a name for the thing or doesn't really understand it. If you could give like a really brief understanding for the listener who doesn't know what it is yet. And then I have another thing I want to ask you about it after you define it for the listener.
Well, and that's great. I mean, I think, first and foremost, I'll kind of define it in relationship to Twice Exceptionality and how that fits into the narrative of my movie and sort of how I landed on that being, a focus. So as I was developing the film and, really sort of navigating what does 21st century giftedness look like, and that's a real broad concept, I landed on, this concept of twice exceptionality. And it's it landed in my life through a connection with a woman named Melanie Hayes, who is now a major character in the film. And she founded an independent micro school here in the Bay Area called Big Minds. And long story short, she allowed us access to the school, the parents, the kids, and we spent quite a bit of time filming there and, kind of getting into this sort of the way of life for these children, right? And for many of these children, it's the last stop educationally. They've tried everywhere else. Their parents have had them everywhere else, and nothing has worked. And so what we know about 2E kids, and we can talk about adults in a second, but what we know about 2E kids is that typically they present in ways that traditional learning environments may land them in special ed, number one, which can be crushing for them because they are actually intellectually quite, high caliber. Okay. So the twice exceptional child is, intellectually, a superstar in some ways over here, but they have other learning challenges over here that mask that intelligence. And, what that looks like on the learning difference side is ADHD, autism spectrum, dysgraphia, visual spatial learning challenges. For one of our characters who's 2E in the movie, that actually looks like face blindness. Okay, so he can't recognize people ever, and he's worked hard to recognize voices so he can use voice to help him navigate social situations. But imagine if you didn't recognize anybody, right? And how that would make you perceived socially in public situations or even in like family situations, right? So he really presents as autistic, right? But put him in a coding room and he's a superstar and coding is like his thing. So that's a way of understanding it. When we say neurodiverse, on the other side of that is neurotypical, right? So think about our society at large, right? How many people are typical? Like what does even typical mean? More of us than less of us are actually pretty diverse in the 21st century. So if you sort of bring that into concepts around the brain or neuroscience, think about that. More people than less are actually probably pretty neurodiverse, right? There are many people who are in the middle who are a median, but neurodiversity, I think, is, if you think about it from a 360-degree perspective, you may have people who, excel in one thing and are challenged in other things, right? And what's great about 2E and neurodiversity is that it's gotten education professionals and advocates and policymakers and people who care about this stuff, therapists, other professionals who work with these populations, to actually embrace this idea that there are more neurodiverse people on the planet probably than less, and that we owe it to our society at large to try to figure out how to serve them, because these are huge numbers of people who, when they're not being served and are left to their own devices, it can register in all kinds of traumatic narratives. But when supported and given the chance to excel, it looks like potentially success, great success and achievement, which is, ultimately, I think what we hope for most people is that they at least get the chance to figure out who they are and be contributing members of a civil society that values them, right? So neurodiversity, it's not just the savant who, is autistic, okay? I think that, and I don't disregard that person, because they're out there, but I think what it is, it's more of a swimming pool of potential in our neuro narrative, if you will. And the 2E person, it's a great concept, right? Twice exceptional, right? It really challenges this idea of what does even exceptional look like? What does exceptional behave like? What does it sound like? And it allows us not to pigeonhole people who don't behave exactly how we think they should in traditional social environments like school, right? So for example, if a child is freakishly upset by the when they have a sandwich and their bread has the needs to have this sort of the outside of it cut off so they don't have to see the sides of the bread. Like we have a character in our movie that was a major thing that upset him that would throw him into meltdown. And people see that child in a restaurant or a lunch spot and they think, oh, bad parenting. Or they think that child will never be successful. That child will never be smart. We are connecting with and interacting with twice exceptional and neurodiverse people all the time. Melanie and her family in our movie, for me, they are like sort of the exemplar 2E family. So I've really positioned them in the movie as an all-American family. Like the idea that the 2E people, they live among us. They're your neighbors, whether you live in an apartment or housing complex, like there are 2E people among you, and I think it's a question of like, who do we value, who gets our social and emotional supports, and if there are more people than less who get access to those kinds of things, maybe we're going to have that many more people who actually are like contributing to our lives.
Right. I always say we're everywhere you want to be, like a Visa commercial, because there is more diversity than sameness. And I think people are finally waking up to that. And
how can there not be when there are 7 billion people on the planet, hundreds and hundreds of languages and cultures, and, and we're living in this kind of increasingly globalized, world where experience reflects that, as does knowledge. So I think the 21st century, my personal view is that neurodiversity, whether it registers as twice exceptionality or some other expression of that, is a major theme of this century. Okay, it's new, so it's just gaining ground. It's a movement in motion. Families and educators and other professionals are self-organizing and getting people to take, to pay attention to these things. 2E is not endorsed. It's not endorsed by the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, but it's starting to get taken more and more seriously, and it's getting into public school conversations, and we're looking at how we can serve more and more of these kids in traditional settings. It's another form of diversity, right, in this increasingly diverse world.
Exactly, and I believe that all effective awareness comes from the people anyway. And so the people are the ones, all of us who live it and engage with it and everything. We're the ones that are going to create the change and the awareness anyway. It's not top down like so many people think. It's the people, which is why I invited you to be on the show, because you're the people, like you're part of us people out there living your vision and doing what your soul knows is the highest, best thing to do. I walk around inspiring and waking up people, and you're walking around inspiring and waking up people, and we have a lot of the same creativity and a lot of different and a lot of all different things. And when we step into what our soul is meant to do, the world changes. And so I'm hoping that all of you hear this conversation and are listening to Marc and going within yourself and realizing that you have a message and you have a voice. And if you're not using it for your own betterment and the betterment of others, contact somebody to get some guidance or support or whatever, because the truth is not everybody understands us. And there is somebody who understands this. In fact, there's a lot of people where sometimes we just have to be open to it. And I think you're getting that flavor.
Can I build on that really quickly, just to say that, the name of your podcast, which is what got me excited to talk to you, Someone Gets Me, right? This is so key in our experience, right? To feel like you are a part of something bigger than yourself. And I think that, all this kind of bigger kind of cultural conversation about how we become so tribal and it's so bad, right? Really demonizing this idea of like people kind of finding tribes and finding people who are like-minded. We're so in our silos, right? But I think that, we get to decide whether that's good or that's bad. Maybe we don't have to think about these things in such a binary way. It doesn't have to be all good or all bad. Maybe it's more on a continuum of experience. But at the end of the day, if you are isolated and you feel that no one gets you, right? That moment when someone finally does is a change maker, right? And so I encourage people, people who are home, who are isolated, who are physically able to get off social media and get out in the communities, do it. Volunteer. It will get the most, get the endorphins, released out of your brain in a way that will surprise and delight you. Like, there is nothing more delightful than being a part of a community. And when you show up, you are appreciated. People value people who show up. You got to get out of the house. You got to get out of the house. It can be the hardest thing for people sometimes to do, but when you do, it can really change your life.
That's absolutely true on every level. So you're an extrovert and I'm an introvert. And so it's kind of funny. I love social situations, though. I just recharge, kind of by myself. And the name of the podcast comes because every person who interacts with me for the first time on our first call or our first meeting, where they're looking for some support or help or guidance, they walk out and that's what they say, someone gets me. Because it is a game changer that I hear them and I get it and I can hear what they're saying and hear what they're not saying, so that finally their existence is validated as valuable and worthy, because that's truly how I see people. I see people as God with skin, and we get to be the hands and feet of the divine. And it comes in all these amazing myriad of ways that together we make this amazing, amazing puzzle, or however we want to look at it. So I really believe in getting out and connecting with people, human to human. And I see it in all of the people I work with all of our different brains and the different things we do. It's that human connection that makes all the difference in the world. And even when I'm myself, because I like to be alone a lot, but I know when I get to connect with people and I have that opportunity, then it charges me up in a different way than when I do things that are recharging by myself. So that balance is so important. The other thing I want to mention before we get ready to wrap the show up is the whole idea of not looking at things that you mentioned so binary, that it's all this good or bad, right or wrong, black or white. And that's not the way the world is. It's the way it never was. It's just the construct that was created, that we're trying to come out of the trance and the delusion that things are good, bad, right, wrong, black, white. And it's not the way it is at all. And so maybe sometimes our first step, or somebody's first step in starting to kind of come into themselves, is to give themselves permission to not define everything as good, bad, right, or wrong. It just is what it is. And how does that work, or how does it fit? I always ask the question, how does this work? What's good about it? Then go from there. And so that kind of freedom and flexibility is key, I think, to being able to really see the greater picture. So I'm really glad you brought that up. So the G Word film is going to be coming out next year in 2020, right?
Yes, that's what we're aiming for 2020.
I cannot wait to see it. And when Julie was telling me about how amazing you are, and then I'm so glad that you contacted me, because I'm like, oh my God, I get to meet him. And I'm so excited that you're doing this film. And I'm so excited that you are doing all the work that you're doing. And it's so delightful to get to meet you and have this conversation. I feel like I've talked to you forever. And I would like to ask one last question. Actually, I have two last questions. The next question is, what's your favorite food to eat?
Oh my God, that's a great question. So I'm just gonna go there, and I'm gonna tell you it's like sushi and anything Japanese. Okay, so this is it's high protein, tastes so good. And I was really fortunate to be able to spend a month in Japan making a film back in 2009. And I just fell in love with that country and that culture and the sense of hospitality, but also the sense of precision in how food is prepared. They have a very strong, Japanese culture, like longevity is a big thing, right? Some of the oldest living people live in Japan, and it's so tied to their diet, right? So they eat well and they eat healthy, and it's good food. Like, don't be afraid of raw foods. There's not a lot that gets between you and the quality of what you're eating.
Oh, that's amazing. And I'm cracking up because I just did an interview yesterday with a woman who's from Greece who lives in the US now. And I asked her what her favorite food was, and she said sushi. 2 people in a row. And I don't think anyone else has said that. I'm not sure. But I like to ask a lot of interesting people what their favorite food is, because it always brings that space of joy. And there's always a level of creativity to not only the food, but the answer that goes with it. It always is amazing. And okay, so that question was great. Is there anything else that I didn't cover? I know there's a ton of things, but if you can imagine the person listening to us right now that maybe is finally feeling a little hopeful or is yearning for that connection, and you've had all this amazing life experience and you're very, very talented, what would you say to that person maybe who is feeling a little stuck or not so hopeful right now, or listening to us and wants to grow that extra, stretch that little further step? What would be a message to them that they could kind of grab onto and leave this podcast with feeling like, I can do that one thing. I can do this one thing to help myself move forward. What would you say to that person?
I think if you're feeling stuck, there's the question of like, what would make someone unstuck, right? And if the feeling of being stuck is one that is about isolation or not feeling supported in whatever aspect of your journey you are, trying to develop yourself, I say find a mentor. Like, that is a huge way to get out of yourself and, try to, get some feedback. I think, a mentor could look like a lot of different things. It could be someone like myself who actually, might have more experience in filmmaking. And if you're interested in film, you reach out to me and, see if, if I'm willing to spend some time with you to help you, think about your career. Like, I think that, ultimately what I know in my heart is that people love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about their work, and they love to be valued for their work, right? So someone who may seem unreachable or unapproachable to you because they're successful or they're somehow busy or they're somehow, they'll never respond to my email. Like, that's really not how it works. We're all on a trajectory of learning. And if I actually, I've been mentored and I mentor, I mean, it's a huge piece of how all this makes sense. I'm a real believer that leadership happens at every stage of our lives. I know that I was a leader when I was young. It was a huge part of my identity. And so that mentor may surprise you who they are. But you got to get out of yourself, and you got to get out of your own head, and you got to be a little fearless around reaching out to people who you want to have in your network, who you want to be a part of your community. Just that one person who says, yes, I'll mentor you, or yes, I'll read your whatever, or, it's just that one-to-one relationship that will remind you that there's potentially more than that one, right? And so if you're stuck, like, you just got to be fearless, and I know that can feel like the hardest thing to do sometimes, but the way that you feel on the other end of that is so awesome, right? So if that's my, forget fear, throw it aside. What are you afraid of? Don't be afraid. We only live once, and there are really, it's a tough world. Okay. I'll go on record with that. Half the time it's miraculous that more of us aren't really stuck, by all of the craziness that we deal with day in and day out. There's, we have more and more people with mental health challenges. There's more and more depression. There's more and more people who really are just, feeling the stress of 21st century life and how accelerated everything has become and how hard it is to connect with people. you get to be the one who decides for yourself how to fix that. Okay. I always say to myself, Dianne, I get to decide how angry I want to get about something. I get to decide how upset I want to get about something. Okay. That is my personal choice. Okay. There are situations that just will make someone angry. Like, that's real and that's valid. Right. But if anger and hurt are like your main way of being in the world, that is something that you can dial down. And that is something we can all work on. And that is something that you can take positive steps to lessen your load. You know, we all see those angry people on the streets. We've all interacted with those angry people, like when we're driving, or these people who just, they lean into anger and hurt so quick. And my heart goes out to them, you know, and maybe even I've been that person. We've all been that person, right? But at the end of the day, who do you get to sit with alone at night and look in the mirror is yourself, right? And you get to decide how stuck or unstuck you want to be, right? And how long you want to be in that place, right? And so, you know, gratitude, that's key. Focus on gratitude. What can you be grateful for? What in your life is working? You know, it's so easy to see the glass half empty, but really it can be seen as half full. And these are sort of, you know, funny cliches that sort of, you know, ring true for a very real reason. I have had people that I work with who are so glass empty type personalities. And half of my job is helping them see that the glass really is half full, okay, as opposed to half empty. So it's about perspective. It's about shaking yourself up. It's about getting out in the world and realizing that there are people out there who may want to help and support you. You just have to find them, and you know what? You have to ask.
So you have to ask, and the glass is refillable in my world. And that's like what I do is I mentor people to help them like get unstuck and everything. And so, and you never know where the mentors are there. People will say something to me sometimes about being busy or whatever it is, but I never am too busy to support or help or assist or guide somebody who authentically is asking in a real manner, just not trying to like steal my energy and move on. So I really appreciate that answer. And so if you're feeling stuck out there or you're not really sure where to start, you're going to have Marc's website and you can reach him, and you're going to have my website and you can reach me. So no longer do you have the excuse that nobody gets you, because 2 people get you right here and many more. And you have a solution and a resource available to you. So the excuses can now leave because they have been squashed and washed away by this very conversation that has been absolutely amazing and thrilling. And like I said, we could go on much longer, so we might have to do a round 2 because it's so fun to talk about all these great ideas. So thank you, Marc, for being on the show and for being so willing to share what you really believe about things. I love your authenticity and your enthusiasm and your extroversion, and I love your creativity. The world is such a better place because you're in it, and don't ever forget that. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, Dianne. And to everyone listening, thanks for paying attention. If my films are something that connect with you, I'm sure it'll all be in the show notes. My company's called 13th Gen Film. I've made a lot of films about a lot of very human stories. And at the end of the day, it's really about that human connection through storytelling. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk about not just my film work, but what else I'm about as a person. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you for being so open. And I think I would love to do another interview with you on just the storytelling piece. I think that would be really exciting. So remember, everybody, keep your face to the sun so the shadows fall behind you, and you're a rock star. So go out there and let your brilliance shine. The world needs you. Until the next time, be well.
Thanks for tuning in to Someone Gets Me. To find out more, please visit Dianne's website at MissDianneAllen.com. That's MissDianneAllen.com. Be sure to take a second and subscribe to the show and share with anyone that you think may benefit. Until next time, remember the world needs your special gift. So let your light shine.